All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you with our second series in our Connect with the Experts Endocrinology series, our second episode of this series. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, we are going to dive into the topic of puberty. So we all know that that's a big topic in Duchenne and something that certainly is worth having some additional conversation. So we've got two great speakers with us today, Dr. Robert Benjamin, as well as Austin Leclaire. So we're going to hear a little bit about the science behind Duchenne and puberty from Dr. Benjamin, and then we're also going to hear a little bit about that patient perspective from Austin. So we're really excited to have you on the phone today. At the midpoint of our presentation, we'll go ahead and transition to a Q&A portion of our time together. So feel free to throw those questions in the chat box and we'll get through as many of those as we can. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Rob Benjamin.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, families. Welcome to a topic everyone wants to talk about right after lunch, which is puberty. I'm excited to be here and to talk with you. I am at Duke University, and I've had the privilege of meeting many of you in our clinics there. The pleasure has been mine, but this question of puberty comes up a lot, and I thought it would be great to get an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about what happens with puberty, to hear questions from you all and from the real star of the show, Austin, who's joining us. So I'm going to share my screen. Austin, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right, good. So it looks like I'm sharing. Great. Well, again, thank you, everybody, for inviting me to speak. My agenda today, I'm going to describe normal puberty, what happens, when does it start, what changes you can expect to see, and then when is it late or delayed. I'll then briefly talk about the steroids effects on puberty, talking here about prednisone and Flaza in particular. And then discuss where we come in sometimes in our clinic with treatment options. And then again, really the most important part of today is to hear from you all and make sure your questions are answered. I know those questions are always good ones and make us all think a lot. So what is puberty? Defined, puberty is a transition from sexual immaturity to maturity. The changes that both physical and mental changes can be significant as we go through puberty. But I thought I'm just going to really focus on puberty in boys, young men. And what happens to start this all off is we have a small gland that sits behind our eyes in the brain called the pituitary gland. And this is sort of the hormone control center in the body. This controls a lot of different areas, including our thyroid, our growth, our stress response, how well we control water in the body, but it also is the critical driving center for puberty. And the pituitary sends out its brain messages, which I've abbreviated LH and FSH. You don't really need to know their names, but these messages then travel to the testicles and they cause the testicles to grow. They cause them to produce testosterone and they cause the testicles to produce sperm. Testosterone has a lot of effects in the body, including causing some of those physical changes that you might see, and also can probably be linked to marked mood changes you may notice, and also has a critical role in bone health. So what are the changes you might expect to see in puberty and that are largely mediated by testosterone? Hair is one of the things you could see. Hair on the arms and on the legs, even part of the face, is really not pubertal hair. That can just be, if you notice you have more hair there, that can just be a family pattern usually. But when you get it in under the arm or in the private area around the penis and testicles, that's more significant and could suggest that puberty has happened. Acne happens with a rise in testosterone and other hormones in the body, and body odor are also described. But it should be noticed that you can have these findings and not be in puberty. You have other areas in your body that can make hair hormones, but they aren't as strong as testosterone and they aren't involved in making sperm and other things downstream. So you have other areas in your body that can do this. So really, the first sign that puberty has really begun is that the testicles grow in size. And that's something that usually kids don't always know when they come in to see me. And that's why we do such a thorough physical exam. But you also will get penis growth at the same time. The voice deepens because testosterone and other male hormones go to the vocal cords and coarsen them, and that's why the voice will drop as kids get into puberty. Moodiness, well, you may have moodiness before puberty. That's usually not made better by that initial surge in testosterone and other pubertal hormones. This is a normal thing and usually does level out as the body gets sort of used to the hormonal chaos that is puberty. You also may notice increased sleeping behavior and appetite. I can think of my own kids. I have a 15 and 17-year-old who regularly are eating out of our pantries late night, and we have to shake awake at about 11 or 12 a.m. when left to their own devices, as opposed to when they were pre-pubertal and getting up at the crack of dawn to keep us on our toes. So definitely big sleep changes, and that's probably partly because of the amount of growth that goes on. So you have marked increases in weight and height gain that often happen with puberty. So when does it start? Boys are probably a little early if testicular enlargement happens before age 9, but we usually see it most often around 11. We give a wide range of what's normal because we don't get concerned in my clinic if puberty hasn't begun by 13 or 14, but we start maybe investigating possible causes. One thing that was so frustrating to me as a kid before I knew anything about hormones is that boys do develop after girls. I always heard this, the girls would always say they were more mature, and I hated that. So probably proving my immaturity, actually. But it actually is true that girls develop 2 years ahead of boys, or boys are 2 years later. So it can be alarming if you have a boy and girl in your house and the girl starts growing, significantly earlier than the boy, but that's normal. In fact, this is made more, it's more pronounced because girls often hit their growth spurt early in puberty and boys late. So girls start early, they have the growth spurt, they can really have a big gap between them and their brothers or their friends. And then boys end up catching up and surpassing them usually. So when do we think puberty is late? We usually have defined this in my field as 14 years of age. It doesn't mean if it hasn't happened by 14, there's necessarily a problem, but we usually, like I said, start doing more testing and may even intervene then. Now, you may, though, have noticed that puberty hasn't even begun in the late teenage years in Duchenne, and there's a good reason for this. Steroids are the answer. We know Emflaza and prednisone in particular, they have very good effects. They have effects that we know are important for preserving muscle strength and other things that you talk with Dr. Smith here at Duke and around the country about. But they also do some things we don't want. And so if we put somebody on Emflaza or prednisone, these are the two that I've seen the most often. I don't know enough about vamorolone and some of the newer medicines to know what their impact is here. But if we put patients on these medicines, what we see is that they go to the brain and they shut off the brain message. So I told you there's that brain message from that hormone control center that's so critical for stimulating puberty. That gets shut off with high doses of steroids, which then lead to reduced amounts of testosterone produced and reduced sperm production. And this can, like I said, this can last into the 20s. In some ways, I would say that young men with Duchenne don't have delayed puberty often, they have blunted or blocked puberty because of the steroids that they're on. This doesn't always get better with age. So when do we start testosterone therapy? We may start at age 14 years, usually don't start before that. I've contemplated doing testosterone a little before 14 in young men with Duchenne because we know steroids have such a strong effect on this, according to the slide I just showed you. But historically, it's been 14. And we've even tried to jumpstart puberty in some young men by giving them 3 months of a low-dose testosterone shot once a month. The whole idea here is you're sort of telling the body what it's like to have testosterone in it by giving a shot. And then the hope is when you pull that away after 3 months, the brain says, hey, I kind of like that testosterone, and it jumps into puberty and starts stimulating you to make testosterone. The problem is it's usually not strong enough to overcome the effects of steroids. The options that we have then for testosterone administration, historically, the best two have been intramuscular shots, which is, row 1 in the table you see before you, and gel, row 3. The shots in the muscle were complexed in oil because it won't last long enough in the bloodstream if you just did it as a straight shot that not complexed in anything. The whole idea is the medicine needs to stick there so you don't have to take it all the time. And people take it about every other week, 2 times a month. The issue there, though, is that it's in the muscle shot, so it hurts. No one likes pain. And it causes a peak of testosterone that happens usually right after you get the shot. And then you can notice a real drop in that level when you're due for your next shot. So patients might complain of fatigue, moodiness when they were due for their next shot. No one likes to go through that, 2 times a month. Recently, we've been using a lot more that same formulation, but giving it under the skin with a much smaller needle. And this is gaining popularity. It's probably the most popular way to get testosterone now in our clinics. It's usually given once a week, and then because it's under the skin, it's not painful. There's really no downside to it. It won't, in terms of administration, it takes a little getting used to because it's sort of thick medicine. So you have to pull it up in a big syringe and then administer it in a smaller one. But once you get the hang of it, it's really, good for patients and for families. But probably the most, the medicine I've used the most over the years has been the gel. And the idea there is you rub it into your skin and it gives you a steady administration every day. You rub it in, it goes through the skin, it doesn't require a needle. The downside is it's messy. If a patient's not administering it, but the family member is, they have to make sure to wear gloves so they don't get exposure. So that has been the most popular because it's level. You get the same dose every day. You don't get these peaks and troughs. But like I said, I think we're moving more towards under the skin shot once a week. And what good things might you notice? Well, testosterone has all the same effects when we give it that your body makes it. It helps the muscles and bones. It may help with height. So again, steroid effects are pretty strong in Duchenne, so we don't always see much improvement in height after starting testosterone. Improve self-esteem as you're entering into what is a normal developmental stage. Again, the bad thing about giving testosterone is it's not the same as your testosterone. So nothing is as good as the original product that your body makes. And this is true of the sources. As I showed you, the testosterone has to be given as a shot. People don't always like shots. It has to be given as a messy gel. People don't like a mess. And it's not going to be the same, exact same medicine or hormone that your body makes naturally. The big issue, though, and why we don't start this in everyone, is it stops you from making your own testosterone. And that's something we don't want to do unless we're absolutely sure you can't do it. So if we go back to this figure I showed you early on the slide where the brain is sending the message to the testicles that make sperm and testosterone, if I start giving you testosterone instead, it will do all those same things. You'll see the physical changes, the mood changes, the helping your bones out, but it also will tell your brain, like the steroids are doing, it'll say, I've got this covered. You don't need to do anything. We don't need any brain message from you. Therefore, you won't make your own testosterone and you won't make sperm if we put you on external testosterone medication. So this is why we always want to make sure that you can do it and give you ample time to be able to do it before we do it. All right, last slide. To summarize, testicular enlargement is the first true sign that puberty has happened. If you have hair, body odor, acne, moodiness, that can all be changes that we see around puberty, but it does not mean puberty has happened. Boys start after girls. Steroids do a lot of good things, but they also do some things we don't like their effects on growth, on bones, which you've already heard about, and they block testosterone production. And then we have options with shots or gels, but we try not to give it unless we're absolutely sure you can't do it. That's all I've got. Austin, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, so I think maybe one of the ones is because I know the biggest one for parents for deciding if they want to do these treatments is about the mood situation. And I think maybe it's important to touch on, is there any ways to like counteract that effect or anything like that?
Moodiness?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Uh, I don't know if it's been invented, I would have used it in my own house. I was talking to Rachel about that before. I would say um, we have to adjust how we are as parents with our kids, and we also expect kids to adjust with us, but we have to compromise. And I think probably the best way to handle moodiness, especially when you know there's a hormonal basis to it, is don't overanalyze it, don't draw extra attention to it, because that usually makes things worse. But make sure that you are doing the simple things well, which is eating healthy, getting enough sleep, feeling rested. If there's something that's stressing you out, talking about it. Again, family time and family communication can make a lot of this better. But I would say with most people, as they're going through these hormonal changes, just not calling attention to it, making them feel bad about it, and realizing that it should level out with time. Being even with your expectations as a parent, I would say. I like to think of it as neutral energy. So if your child is bringing negative energy because of moodiness, let's bring positive energy and be neutral, and let's try to level things off. But that's just one approach. There isn't a medicine or anything that you need to take for
Yeah.
it.
So another thing that I noticed was really interesting. So I was going through delayed puberty. So I had delayed puberty, but the one thing that I thought was odd is I started going through it, but I started going through it around the time I started doing exon skipping. So when I
Interesting.
was on that medication, I noticed the difference. And the one thing that I'm not sure about is if that maybe had something to do with it. Like, I don't have any science to back it or whatever, but I just have a theory that that could have had something to do with it. So I was really interested in seeing maybe someone might have interest in doing some study to like see what the effects exon skipping has on puberty, because obviously exon skipping hasn't been out that long. So I don't
Right.
think people have really thought about how there could be a connection.
Well, that's how great science starts, Austin. And with a question like that, hey, has anyone ever thought of this? And certainly some of the greatest discoveries we've had have begun with a question. And who better to come up with a question than somebody who's experienced it? So I commend you for thinking about those thoughts. What I would say is, if you take a young man with Duchenne and you don't put them on steroids, usually they will have puberty at the normal time and normal duration. There's not something in that gene that usually inhibits puberty from happening. So all the wiring is there. You have a pituitary gland that's sending a message down to the testicles, but that message is low for everybody before they hit the pubertal years. There's nothing wrong with that fundamentally in Duchenne. It's usually the impact of steroids. When people have an intervention, I often encourage them to think, did anything else change in your life at that time? Did they change your steroid dose? Could that have impacted your health, or were you just the age when this usually happens? If they had an intervention that happened at 14 or 13, it might be that that's why puberty began. But your question's a good one, and looking at possible studies in science is always a good answer. But I would, to expanding your question a little more would be, some of you may say, well, why did I have puberty then if the steroids do this and know this effect? And, when you're saying that it shouldn't have happened, or it often doesn't happen in young men with Duchenne, and I'd say everybody's different. Everyone has a different threshold for how they respond to the steroid. Some people require 10 milligrams of Enflazza a day, others require 25. And maybe some people have a lower, it's harder to suppress their puberty than in others. Everybody has different body types and different architecture, internal and external. So that might be a reason why you see a difference. But that's even more reason why we wait and try to have you prove that you can do it before
Because I
starting.
guess, like you're saying, there's so many different variables. We don't know what other medications people are taking. We don't know how much they're taking of it.
That's
And
right.
obviously, some of these questions we can't really answer, like, unless we actually know the person's history or whatever. But I think that that's definitely good to consider, that there's many different things. Because
Absolutely.
with other medications too, you need different dosages for different people.
No question. And people have looked at weekend dosing versus weekday dosing, different steroids, not to mention some of the newer steroids that are being investigated. The hope is that we'll find medicines that can give us peak effect for what we want it to do for muscle preservation and everything and activities of daily living without any of those other side effects that where I come in. I would love nothing more than for an endocrinologist to not be needed anymore. We didn't have problems with growth. We didn't have problems with bone health. We didn't have problems with puberty. These would all be possible really if we can find a better steroid or science such as what you mentioning that lead to improvement of Duchenne without medicine.
So I think this is really going to an important piece that it's important that everyone notice like what they're going through and have those theories, because that information really does help us come to some conclusion. Because some of these questions, you don't come up with a solution to an issue you didn't know you had.
That's
So
right.
that's the same thing with engineering. I've noticed that you aren't going to find a solution to something if you don't have a problem to solve.
You don't know what the question is. Yeah, absolutely right. And that's where your care team comes in. And having a comprehensive care team. When I asked people at one of the talks with PPMD a couple of years ago to raise their hand, how many had heard of an endocrinologist, only about half the room, and how many actually has seen an endocrinologist was about a quarter of the room. So I feel like, as awareness becomes more widespread about the different possibilities, we'll be more and more integrated into those clinics and hopefully can provide help and answers to families.
Yeah, I've personally been going through that with my care, for example. I'm starting to take my care a little more seriously because when I was younger, my mom obviously was very, she did a lot of my health care. And so she was very, like, knew what I need to do, like what was good for my health. But when I got older, I stopped wanting to take all the extra medications, and I was just taking what I just need, like just the basics that I needed. And recently I was in the hospital for a week, and it really was because I wasn't taking all those medications that I should have, that my mom was making me take. So now I started having the realization that I do need to take all those medications, and it isn't just for funny. It's not just for fun. I actually need to take them. So I thought that was a really important lesson. I hate that I had to be in the hospital for a week, but definitely was a wake up call that I need to take my health more seriously and see a full care team and consider every aspect of my health.
Both really, really great points. And, you have a perspective, wisdom that is above your years and age. But what I'd say is, both points are important ones. You should ask questions about the medicines you're on. Never put something in your body that you don't understand how it functions or what the side effects are. So challenge your providers. Why am I on this? Can my dose be lowered? Does it have to be where it is? That should be a question that you feel comfortable asking. And that's part of that transition into adulthood, is taking on your condition, but feeling comfortable to advocate for yourself and say, please explain why I'm on this. But then the second part of that is when you trust the answer and you trust your providers to actually make sure you take those medicines every day. I think if I asked parents, if we had a big room to people to raise their hand, how many were great about taking medicines every day when they've had to, if we're being honest, it probably is less than 50%. It's hard to take a medicine every day, and especially if you're taking more than one. So it's by no means a judgment if you're told by your providers, hey, you need to take your medicine, but more such an important precaution because we want to avoid those consequences.
I think we have a question coming in.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so everybody on the phone, go ahead, submit those questions through the chat box. You can ask questions of either Dr. Benjamin or Austin. That's why we've got them here. You can pick their brains. So this first question is, how long should you wait to see if your own testosterone production will increase with low dose shots before increasing levels or increasing that dose?
Yeah. My answer to that would be, if you're getting these shots around age 14, which is sort of the established age of when puberty should have begun, and if your testosterone level, like many of my patients, is starting very, very low, almost undetectably low, then I would usually just give this 6 months of shots of injections. And some even only do 3 months, but I don't see a danger in doing 6, low dose, 25 to 50 milligrams. If that doesn't work, then I don't feel like there's a reason to keep doing that. I would probably just start on more therapeutic levels, because that's under what we usually do for starting doses. But so your answer, I'd usually say about 6 months. And I would say in practice, I see people every 6 months. So usually I do shots for about 4 of those. And then we try to see if things have jumped in on their own for the last 2 months leading up to that visit. So I don't do 6 shots, usually 4. Good
Great,
question.
thanks so much. That was a super good question to the person that submitted it, so thank you. So here's an interesting question. Dr. Benjamin, I'll have you start with this, and then maybe Austin, you can pipe in with your own personal experience. So the question reads, when you start testosterone for boys or men with Duchenne, do you find any improvement in osteoporosis? How many young men would continue to need testosterone supplementation through adulthood? We're being told that we may need to do this for our son.
That's a great question. So my answer to that would be, we don't really know what the immediate impact is of testosterone on osteoporosis, but and there's no perfect study for this. Many of you probably have had bone density scans, and those are imperfect. They're one of the better studies that we have, but still imperfect in how we judge this. So if you have an improvement in how thick your bones look on that scan, does it mean that was because of testosterone, or could other factors be involved? Those some of the issues that aren't really known, and we don't usually get a bone density scan right before and then measure it, right after starting. So it's unclear oftentimes if you're making a big difference with that. And because at the core of this, steroids are the big reason why you are osteoporotic. In addition to a lack of mobility and weight bearing, usually it's a combination of those things. So if the steroid doses stay the same and all we're doing is putting somebody on testosterone, then we could look at this over a longer period of time. What I can say is there's no way it's getting worse than it would without testosterone. Testosterone is really thought to be critical for bone mineral, how we build bones and how we set up our bones to be built, particularly in the later teenage years and early 20s. This is all population, not just young men with Duchenne. So I talk to my patients who need to go on therapy, the critical nature of being on it during that time period in particular, because you set yourself up for the rest of your life with how you do in that 18 to 23-year-old range with your bone mineral. And to answer your other question about whether this is lifelong or not, usually once you start testosterone therapy, you continue on it. The way to know whether you need it or not is to stop it after several years and see if you're able to make testosterone on your own. You have to give this some time, because your brain has basically said, I don't need to do anything now for this long period of time. But you can always challenge it by stopping the medicine and checking levels. I would encourage you to do that. Just don't do it too long, because again, we want to make sure and protect the bones.
So another part that I think would be good for us to touch on is, so with like your back curving, I've heard that that once you get through puberty, though, like you're pretty much good and your back isn't going to curve. I just think maybe it might be important to talk about that as well.
Yeah, so scoliosis and various, I'm not an expert on this. This is really something that the orthopedic physicians deal with the most. But what I think you're getting at, Austin, is that most of our growth is done after puberty and after, when boys hit 16 to 18, usually they're done growing, and therefore they're done growing, the curvature is going to be less at that point. Testosterone and intervention there for puberty shouldn't impact the degree of curvature. But the other point to make here is if you have a lot of scoliosis, it can sometimes make reading the bone density scans harder. So harder to interpret, harder to come away and say, hey, the bones are here, they're thicker or than they should be, or they're not as thick as they should be. We're doing studies more now, and I know there's a move, in Duchenne to look at spine films as a better marker of how the bones are doing. Are there spine fractures, compression fractures, and things that we have to that we might see more easily and judge more easily, and certainly cause pain and discomfort for our young men. So I'd say long-winded answer, but scoliosis usually gets better after puberty because growth slows, and you usually remain on testosterone once you start on it. There aren't perfect markers of how it's doing on bone density.
So in other words, it's really good to take care of your bone health early on before puberty, because after that, that's generally when like the way your bones are going to be, that's probably the way it's going to be set for the rest of your life if you did proper bone health before puberty.
Yeah, throughout, really throughout. Having a diet that's balanced in calcium and vitamin D. A lot of young men will be on extra vitamin D. I'm sure, I imagine that was talked about with the bone section of this, but, steroids can increase the metabolism of vitamin D, so you don't have as much in your body that you need. And so having good, bone awareness, bone health is super important. And testosterone, adding testosterone is really important for, preserving that.
So I have a question for you, Dr. Benjamin. I want to go back just a couple of minutes about the concept of temporarily discontinuing the use of testosterone once into adulthood to see if your body's going to then start producing. How long do you typically give the body for those functions in the brain to kind of wake up and then potentially start producing testosterone on its own?
That's a good question. I would say conservatively, I would give it 2 months, to stop and wake up and start. But you probably get away with a month. That's what I've done with other hormone axes in the body when we have patients on medicine and we're challenging them to see if they can do it on their own. So if the steroid dose hasn't changed, there's not really a reason why this would be more likely to start happening on its own by 22 than it would by 18. So the question becomes, should we wait until 18 to do this when we know how important it is for bone health? And I think most have suggested starting closer to 14 is probably the better time to do it. But
so with that in mind,
yeah,
Austin, I have a question for you. What would you tell families who are listening in and considering putting their younger sons on testosterone for delayed puberty? What sort of pearls of wisdom would you share with the community?
I think that it's really important to do it early on, because I think that the earlier the better, I think, because the social aspect of it, socially, you'll interact with people very differently if your puberty is delayed versus them still going through it, because mentally you are different. Once you go through puberty, it changes from your mental aspect. So I think the interaction with people your age gets a little more complicated if you're not at that, because everyone else that age, obviously at that age, every kid's nasty to each other at that age. So I think that it's really good for the social aspect to do it earlier, because I don't think people really think about how much it really does affect how you socialize with people. And the biggest part, I think, about school, the early age, is developing those connections with other people and learning how to interact in society.
Good point. I think that's the nasty comment is so telling. And I think what I usually talk to my patients about in all clinics is people are petrified in their teenage years that there's something different about them, and they therefore make fun of anything they see as different, or they want to join in if they feel bad about themselves. And it's too bad, because once we get into our more adult years, I think the kindness ratio goes up. I'll say this, I've been in so amazed and impressed with how kind the young men with Duchenne I followed have been to a person. I can't imagine. I don't remember the last time I had an interaction with someone who just wasn't kind and kind to everybody else. So just amazing strength and compassion. So you're right that earlier will lessen that. Hey, you're different from me. You don't have facial hair. That point, but I'd say, we don't see it really before about age 14. It doesn't mean couldn't do it at 13, but typically that's been 14. So I agree with you. Doing it earlier is better than later. And if it makes things easier from a social transition standpoint, great. And that's the goal too.
And Austin, I just want to commend you for that point too, because I think that it's really easy to just think about the medical implications and think about just, tunnel vision, puberty, steroids, Duchenne. But, I think your point of the social implications are just really paramount. And I think sometimes it can be easy to forget that that's just as, if not more important, right?
Yeah, I struggled with it when I was going through high school and stuff, because everyone else, they had already been through puberty, and then I was 18 and it was happening. So it was like just making it really difficult for me. And obviously, like being in a wheelchair, you do feel socially isolated and different. And it has emotional implications like depression and anxiety. So I think that like testosterone has a big part to do with, I think, depression and anxiety. So I think that because with the mental development, like you're not really necessarily understand like what your body's going through.
Yeah, good point. I'll add the one thing that parents often ask about is side effects from giving testosterone versus making it. And one of the things I hear about is there increased aggression? Is there increased moodiness? It shouldn't happen more so than it would have with regular puberty, because we use such small doses, and that's tends to be true across all patient populations. So yeah, you may notice more moodiness. That's just a common part of your body getting used to testosterone, but you shouldn't notice severe swings if you start conservatively enough.
Cool. All right. So I have another question. We'll shift gears a bit. But I know, Austin, you said you went through puberty a lot later than your peers. And so the question that came to my own mind was, Dr. Benjamin, do you see much of a difference in how long puberty takes from start to finish, whether it happens naturally versus medically induced?
Well, normally, if puberty happens on its own, boys have about 4.5 years of pubertal time. And this manifests, you usually grow around 2 inches a year before puberty starts. And then there's a spike in growth right towards the end of puberty, up to 4 to 5 inches in a year. And then it slows down and the growth plates close, usually by about 16. And there are varieties here. So it's usually about 4.5 years total. But we see great variety in this. I have patients who've had a shorter puberty than their peers, and that's been frustrating because they've ended up shorter than they would have liked to be. When you medically induce it, though, really puberty is being defined by what we're giving. So it's as long as you stay on the medicine. Now, if we were to jumpstart puberty for somebody by giving them testosterone, then we stopped it and they were able to do it on their own, I would expect it to last just as long as it did for anyone who had, normal puberty. So when we induce it by jumpstarting it, it usually lasts as long. But we are careful about dosing. And that's why we use such small doses, because if we give big doses of testosterone early on, it can close the growth plates earlier and you can end up shorter. But that doesn't mean puberty is shortened. It means your growth time is shortened. So if we define puberty as that transition from, being immature into mature man, then what your growth does isn't linked into that. So about 4.5 years usually when it's happening on your own, and then infinite as long as we're giving the medicine externally.
Austin,
But I'll add
do you
about
have
this
anything to add?
I'll
Sorry,
add
go
about
ahead.
the medicine itself, just that to families who are starting it, it's it never ceases to amaze me how much work we have to do to get medicines through a pharmacy. And testosterone can be one of those. So we often have to prove that we're not using it for performance enhancement or other, untoward things. It can take a little doing. You don't just usually prescribe it like an antibiotic and go pick it up at your pharmacy. It can take a little bit more work, and you can only get refills for 6 months at a time, and then you have to often start that process again, which is also beside me because we know, things haven't changed in that time period. But so it can be annoying and frustrating for families trying to get medicine on a timely fashion. What I will say is if you do run into those hurdles, your young man is not at risk by missing a month or two after you've started it. It's not going to cause sickness or, feeling, you might feel a little tired, but it's not going to cause any dangerous side effects if you have to miss it because you're fighting with insurance.
So, as part of proving medical necessity to insurance, what does that really look like from a logistical perspective? Is it a lot of like blood work and labs?
Yeah.
What sort of things do you have to do to be able to prove that?
Yeah, usually it's showing that 2 testosterone levels are low. They often require 2 spaced out by a couple months at least. So I try to get to, but you have to be roughly the right age for it too. I don't know if they've come up with criteria for that, but I couldn't do it in a 9-year-old twice and then try to get it. Usually we have to be around 13 or 14. And then they'll ask, they don't usually ask questions about medicines and explanations of why that puberty might be late, but just if we have 2 testosterone levels that are low, and they very often are, we can get it through with some work.
Great. All right. So the next question is about growth hormone. Does being on growth hormone affect the timing and onset of puberty or when you would otherwise start testosterone treatment?
Yeah, great question. If I'm talking about patients who aren't on steroids and who don't have Duchenne, who are on growth hormone, then it often, we'll time it because often the growth hormone starts well before the puberty age range. We have to think about normal closure of growth plates and when to start testosterone. Usually we started around the time I said, around 14 or 13 or 14. In Duchenne, oftentimes this conversation begins around 10 or 11. And so if we put somebody on growth hormone therapy, like I said, I could see us moving towards earlier testosterone administration. Growth hormone itself does not trigger puberty though. So it shouldn't affect the testosterone one way or another. In your own son's body without steroids, testosterone will stimulate growth hormone to be made in great amounts. So that's why you hit such a big growth spurt towards the end of your puberty. You have really high testosterone levels, which drive up the growth hormone to peak amounts. But when you're getting those medicines externally, there's very little interaction or overlap. Growth hormone should not stimulate puberty, and testosterone should not affect the growth hormone dosing or levels that you have to give. They're both so impacted by steroids. So, I mean, steroids are the common theme there. They, if you measure your son's, we're not really talking about growth today, but if you measure your son's growth hormone levels, they're often normal in Duchenne. It's that they can't get through the bone to do their job effectively. And this is why growth hormone isn't always super helpful. I know there's some indication that it may be, helpful, but it's not because you're missing growth hormone. It's because your steroids are blocking it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to ask a question of Austin. And then if we don't have any other submissions, we'll start to kind of wind things down a bit. So my question for you, Dr. Benjamin, is, are there any circumstances under which you would not recommend jump-starting puberty?
Well, you would always, you'd want to do it eventually. So let's say that we've put a young man on growth hormone and we're seeing a good response, or we're seeing an improved growth response. And let's say, so that scenario, usually growth has been dampened by the steroids for a while. We put growth hormone on and we're seeing really an improvement. I might wait to start testosterone because as I said earlier, testosterone can close the growth plates. So we may wait to start testosterone towards those later teenage years and feel okay about that from a bone safety standpoint too, to try to maximize the time that you can grow on growth hormone. So if someone was on growth hormone, that might lead to delaying testosterone administration. And the second case would be if I felt like a young man was having less effect from the steroids, or seeming like a less severe presentation of Duchenne there. It looks like they might be able to go into puberty on their own. In that case, we will wait beyond the usual time and give them every opportunity to make it on their own. It still wouldn't be dangerous to jumpstart it, but I would be hesitant to start it, permanently.
Okay, great. All right. And then one more question for you, Austin. What would you tell your fellow guys with Duchenne who are about to embark on this, or maybe have concerns about, delayed starting of puberty, and they're maybe not sure how to bring it up with their providers or their parents? What would you tell them? And what additional final thoughts would you like to share with the group?
So I think you just need to not be embarrassed, because those are things that it's a normal thing to have to talk about and talk to doctors about, even for individuals that are normal. Like, that's a thing that has to come up eventually. And with my house, with my family, fortunately, I'm generally very open with my mom about talking to her about stuff. So in my scenario, it's just really easy to talk about this stuff, because my mom also like works a lot with rare diseases, so she understands that that it's delayed, and that there are going to be different things I'm going to have to talk to her about, rather than what normal people my age would be talking about. So I think that you need to just not be uncomfortable about it. I understand, I know that it's really hard not to laugh about these topics and be uncomfortable, but that's part of it. You just need to feel uncomfortable. Nothing about puberty is comfortable. So I think it's just I know it's really hard to want to get over it, but you just need to talk about it. There's really no easy answer to that.
I don't think you even needed me on this call. I mean, Austin's got it. He's figured it out. What I would say is the communication piece can't be underestimated, can't be overestimated. Really talk to your providers, let them know what questions you have, because oftentimes there can be a gap. Even though we want very much to communicate openly, we may not know what questions you have, and what we may think is obvious to you may be a question mark. To Austin's point, there's no dumb question that you could ask. The worst thing is to walk away not sure of what you're doing or what we're suggesting you do in terms of medication or therapies or other treatments. So be your own advocate, ask those questions, and we learn from you. I mean, this is such a two-way street, that this is not us teaching you or directing you. We want to be a coordinated team. We want to understand where you're coming from, what hesitations you might have. And that's where the open channels of honesty and communication are so important.
Man, oh man, all good stuff. Like Austin said, puberty is already uncomfortable. No sense in being uncomfortable talking about it. I think that's probably the take-home message that I got from all of this. It was really insightful.
Me too.
So no additional questions at this point. I did want to go ahead and mention there is a PAAC hangout tonight. So our PPMD Adult Advisory Committee, they've got an online chat hangout tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern. That's for guys with Duchenne ages 14 and over. So if you aren't signed up yet, or your son isn't signed up yet, get him signed up. You can sign up through the event on the Facebook page. So go check that out. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. We look forward to having you all join us there. You can continue this conversation, but we can also talk about other stuff that's not puberty too. So looking forward to seeing many of you there. And of course, this is recorded, so this is going to continue to remain available on our website. So as things come up, go back, use this as a resource, and you can always shoot us questions and we can get them to Austin or Dr. Benjamin. So feel free to shoot me an email, rachel@parentprojectmd.org. So at this point, I'll go ahead and conclude today's recording with a big thank you to Dr. Benjamin and to Austin. You both were absolutely wonderful. We are really, really lucky to have you both on with us today. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. for having me.
All right.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.